Good evening, everybody. So, I think we're going to have a little bit of feedback if I'm this loudly. So tonight we are at the sixth session of this study of Genesis and creation, and we are halfway through. So there's 6 more to go, and I think tonight's going to be a very interesting presentation. The video I thought was very interesting and not quite as filled with science as some of the others have been. We're not going to be talking about any kind of DNA tonight, but we are going to be talking about the age of the earth. How many of you, just a show of hands, how many of you have heard that the earth is billions of years old? Right? How many of you have friends that believe the earth is billions of years old? Right? Family? Right? That's because there's this whole religion out there that teaches that the earth is billions of years old. So I kind of want tonight, before we get going to the video, which is going to do a lot better job than I am of describing this, but I just kind of want to walk through a little bit for you. Okay? So this is from Exodus 20:11. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. The seventh day. Not the 7th billion year or the 7th millennium, the 7th day. What is a day? Genesis 1:4-5 tells us that the light and darkness were separated by God, and He defined them for us. Night and day, right? It didn't say millennium. It didn't say that today is worth 1 billion of God's years. It said a day, a night and a day. And I'm rambling, but you'll see where I'm going. In Exodus 31:16-17, says that we are told again that God made creation in 6 days. 6 days. It doesn't say 6 billion years. It doesn't say 6 million years, 60 million. It doesn't say any of that. So why is it, with all of the scriptural references, that Christians allow themselves to be bullied or intimidated into the day-age theory? And the day-age theory, and they're going to talk about it, that's where you say, well, one of God's days is, that's 20 million years. That's really a simplistic way of putting the day-age theory, but that's basically the day-age theory in a nutshell. So as we kind of go through tonight, and wherever you are in your walk with God is where you are. But I hope that this will bring you further along in understanding Scripture. Because until we as Christians take the Bible doctrine of recent creation seriously, how can we expect the world to see it any differently than what secularism teaches? We can't go out there afraid and being intimidated and bullied by what is out there. You just can't. You got to stand up, and you got to believe what this tells you. All of it. Remember what I say, and it's not just me. But if you can't believe one part of it, what part of it can you believe? You either believe all of it, or you believe none of it. And I hope you choose all of it. So, let's go. I can't control the slide deck, Lee. All right, got it. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, and that's the first day. Genesis 1:4-5. Can you play the video for us, Lee?
Ask yourself, what was here before? What was Earth like before I existed? What people, what animals have moved through the same space I'm in now? How long has everything been here? Just how old is this place we call home?
Hi, I'm Marcus Lloyd, and welcome to Unlocking the Mysteries of Genesis. In this series, we've been looking at the first book of the Bible and finding there's more truth in it than we may have thought. Today, we're going to explore what Genesis says about the age of Earth and see how it stacks up to the scientific evidence. When we ask, how old is Earth? We're really asking a history question. What is our planet's history? How long has it been here? How was it formed? Unfortunately, no human being was around to see it happen. The best we can do is look at clues and test them with modern science and technology and draw conclusions based on the results. All scientists work with the same data or evidence, the same chemical, biological, and physical clues. They find information in fossils embedded in geologic formations like this trilobite embedded in shale. They also examine current processes that impact our Earth, like sedimentation, erosion, and plate movements. For example, the scientists know that many parts of the continents are covered by geologic strata, layers of rock stacked one on top of another, like these books, building up over time. They also learn from studying natural processes, such as the rate of decay in organic substances like plants and animals. And they can learn by studying the written records of ancient civilizations. These clues are available for all of us. The key is how we interpret the information we get from them. So, how old is the Earth? Let's look at the data and see how both secular and creation scientists interpret them. But instead of talking about it, how about a little field trip? A trip back in time. Our journey takes us all the way back to the beginning, to the creation. But how far back was that? How long will it take us to get there? I'll tell you what, I'm definitely packing a lunch. The age of Earth is a fundamental question, and to find the answers, we turn to both science and the Bible. In both cases, faith comes into play. Let's take a look at some of the methods that scientists use to estimate Earth's age. Age is not something that's always determined exactly. For instance, without your birth certificate or the testimony of your parents, how do you even know your own age, let alone someone else's? All scientists start with certain assumptions about the past, and then use faith in those assumptions, together with geology, physics, and chemistry, to make certain calculations about the planet's age, or more specifically, Earth's rocks. This is called geochronology. Now, there are several different ways to do this, and we sometimes get different results. The clocks that scientists use to estimate the age of rocks have things in common. They all assume, by faith, a constant process rate, like the sand in this hourglass. We assume that will always fall at a constant rate. And next, you need to have what's called a closed process system, like this glass. Nothing getting in there to interfere with the measurements. And finally, scientists have to begin with a known process component. Again, like the sand. You know how much you start with, so you know how much time passes as it falls. Did you get all that? A constant process rate, a closed process system, and a known initial process component. Simply speaking, if you know how much sand you have, and you know how fast it falls, and you know that it always falls at a constant rate, then you can calculate the time. But we'll talk more about that later. Well, now it's time to get going. Are you ready for an adventure? Let's explore the Grand Canyon for clues about the age of the Earth. We come to the Grand Canyon because it's almost as if the Earth has been cut open for us. This is the perfect place to see a cross-section of time. The strata in the walls of the Grand Canyon show the Earth's layers, one stacked on top of the other. The more recent layers on top and the older material below. And the deeper we go into the canyon, the further we go back in time. But how long did it take for all of this to build up? When was the first strata formed? Let's ask an expert.
Secular scientists say with great confidence that the rocks in the Grand Canyon are in the inner gorge more than 1 billion years old, and these layered sediments between 270 and 540 million years old. They base these estimates on the decay of radioactive elements like uranium, and their measurements of how fast uranium decays into lead and helium in the laboratory. These scientists assume that the rate they measure in the laboratory today has been constant since the Earth came into existence. However, about 10 years ago, some of my colleagues and myself found powerful evidence that the rate that uranium decays has not been constant in the Earth's past, but has been as much as 1 billion times higher than we measure it to be today. This has profound implications. It means that this assumption that the secular scientists have been using for the last 100 years is wrong. The implication for the rocks in the Grand Canyon is that these rocks are not hundreds of millions of years old, but only thousands of years old. But what about carbon-14, the method that most people are familiar with? Well, first of all, carbon-14 is used to date the remains of dead plants and animals, and not rocks directly. Carbon is present in every living thing. Carbon has 3 isotopes. Carbon-12 and carbon-13 are stable, but carbon-14 is radioactive. Carbon-14 decays into nitrogen-14 with a half-life of about 5,730 years, meaning half of it will disappear in that time. Plants take in atmospheric carbon. Animals eat the plants, and this introduces carbon-14 into their bodies. As long as the organism lives, it replenishes the amount of carbon-14 in its body, and the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 remains constant. After the plant or animal dies, the carbon-14 in its cells decays back to nitrogen without being replaced, while the carbon-12 and a tiny amount of carbon-13 remains. The amount of carbon-14 as compared to the total amount of carbon in an organism will yield a calculated time since the organism stopped absorbing carbon-14. This age estimate is the calculated time since the organism's death and thus the calculated approximate age of the specimen. But an astonishing discovery, this time made by the secular scientific community over the last 30 years, is that carbon-14 is routinely found at significant levels in fossils that are supposedly tens to hundreds of millions of years old. But compared to those timescales, C14 is like a flash in the pan. There should be no carbon-14 detectable in any living thing older than 100,000 years, or 1/10 of a million years. What this implies is that all fossils are not millions of years old, but only thousands. And all the sediment-bearing layers of rock are only thousands of years old and not millions, including these we see in the Grand Canyon. And this implies that the Grand Canyon almost certainly has to be the product of the year-long Genesis flood, just a few thousand years ago.
The secular dates of these rocks depend on one thing: uniformitarianism. Has everything always happened at a uniform rate? Has sand always fallen at a constant speed, like the second hand of a clock, steadily tick, tick, ticking? Or has it sometimes gone very fast? If it hasn't been constant, well, that's a huge problem for the uniformitarian outlook. Scientists have found soft tissue as well as DNA in fossils, but we know both soft tissue and DNA degrade within hours after death, and certainly after years and centuries. So why do they still show up in fossils that are supposedly millions of years old? Don't worry, we'll get to the bottom of this. To find some answers, let's head deeper into the canyon, closer to the beginning. The prevailing theory is that the Grand Canyon was carved by the Colorado River over millions of years. But let's look at another hypothesis. What if all this didn't happen over millions of years? What if these strata were formed suddenly, catastrophically, like when a volcano blows?
The idea that sediment layers can form quickly was documented in a dramatic way in 1980 with the eruption of Mount St. Helens. The initial blast was a horizontally directed steam explosion with the power of 21 megaton bombs that flattened in seconds 230 square miles of lush conifer forest. Following that, there was 9 hours of eruption of mostly vertical ash driven by steam, that much of vertically back to the ground, and resulted in a horizontal pyroclastic flow, hot volcanic ash flowing at roughly 100 miles an hour. This material formed orderly layers of material, just sediment layers, some just a fraction of an inch thick. And you had tens of feet, hundreds of feet thickness of this material, demonstrated very clearly how rapidly ordered layered sediments can form. Moreover, a single mud flow following the eruption resulted in the carving of a canyon, 1/40th the scale of the Grand Canyon, in one afternoon through this layered debris. So it also demonstrated that canyons can be cut very rapidly, within hours.
So maybe there are flaws in the ways that scientists calculate the age of things. If you go to practically any museum of natural history, they'll tell you that dinosaur fossils are tens of millions of years old. But how can they be sure?
The contradiction, though, is that you have these specimens, coal, wood, even dinosaur bones, that are supposed to be tens or even hundreds of millions of years old, and yet there's still detectable carbon-14 in them. And that just should not be the case. And we think this is illustrating that one of the key assumptions of the method is wrong, the assumption that the decay rates have been constant. Because if you assume that the decay rates have been constant throughout Earth history, you will get millions and billions of years for those dates. But that very assumption leads to a contradiction. If the decay rates have been constant throughout history, then those fossils really are millions of years old, and there should not be any carbon-14 in them, or at least none that we can detect. But there is. And so that's telling us, we think, that there's a problem with the method. Another indication that there's something wrong with the method involves these little crystals called zircons that we find in granite. And within the zircons, you have uranium-238, which is radioactive. And it goes through this multi-step process where that uranium-238 is transformed into lead, a particular isotope of lead. Now, if you look, for instance, at the amount of lead in the zircons, you can figure out how many years of decay that would be at today's rates. And it's about 1.5 billion years. So if you're looking at the lead in the zircons, you would conclude that it's about 1.5 billion years old. But there's another decay product that occurs in this process, and that's helium. When the uranium turns into lead, you have helium nuclei being produced, basically helium atoms minus the electrons. And so they eventually, along the way, they're going to pick up a couple of electrons and they will become full-blown helium atoms. Well, these helium atoms, they don't react very well with other substances, and it's very easy for it to leak out of the zircons. If these zircons really are 1.5 billion years old, why is it that we still see large amounts of helium within the zircons? Because if they're really 1.5 billion years old, most of that helium should have leaked out. So here we have a contradiction within a single method. You have two decay products. You've got lead, you've got helium, and they're giving you two different ages for the zircon. And again, how do you resolve that paradox? Well, one way to resolve it would be if the decay rates have changed in the past.
Because of the types of rocks and fossils found in these layers, experts used to think that it took millions of years for these canyons to form. Now some have come to believe in a catastrophic theory of formation that says it all happened very quickly, violently, like from a global flood. Now, I told you that we'd get to the bottom of these mysteries, and I think that we have. And the answers lie just below our feet and stretch out for hundreds of miles in every direction.
The lowest horizontal lying sediment layer in the Grand Canyon is known as the Tepete Sandstone. From the south rim, one can trace this layer from one horizon to the other. It occurs not just here at the Grand Canyon, but this Tepete Sandstone layer and its equivalents cover a large part of North America. The erosional boundary just below the Tepete Sandstone is commonly known as the Great Unconformity. It's an erosional discontinuity, beveled off the rock beneath it before the Tepete Sandstone was laid down. Just above that boundary, in the lower part of the Tepete Sandstone, we find large boulders. There's one boulder 15 feet in diameter weighing 200 tons in the lower part of the Tepete Sandstone. It boggles the mind to imagine a water process, moving water, able to rip up boulders that large, roll them along, round off the edges, and deposit them in a big layer of boulders, and do it all over the North American continent. So this leads creation scientists like myself to conclude that this must mark the onset of the Genesis flood.
So the evidence suggests that the different strata might have been laid down in a much shorter period of time than we thought. If the rate of change in the Earth wasn't constant, and if these strata didn't form slowly over millions of years, then the assumptions we've been using for our age estimates aren't reliable. And that means that our planet is much younger than secular scientists say that it is. Let's see what the Bible has to say. In Exodus 20:11, we read, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day." That's an important point. Again, in Exodus 31:16 through 17, God says, "Therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed." But what is a day? Can't God define day however he wants? A day being a day, or a day being a million years? The Bible gives us some clues. In Genesis 1:4 and 5, God gives us his definition of day. God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So the evening and the morning were the first day.
We can also work backwards to determine an approximate age of the Earth by using the historical events described in Genesis, and learn how we became many people and how we formed many nations.
So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth. As we'll see in future episodes, modern archaeology combined with history matches up with the biblical accounts. And we know from historical evidence where the nations were. So now our Bible is becoming our history book, our earth clock. We'll also explore this question of day from an astronomical perspective, and we'll see how distant starlight supports the theory of a young universe. Now, many of you are probably asking, why do I need to know this? Why does it matter whether Earth was created billions of years ago or only thousands? What difference does the time make? It matters because of this. If the Bible is wrong or misleading about time in its very first chapters,
where else was it wrong? If God was just being metaphorical in the beginning, then how are we supposed to know when the Bible is being true or when it's just being literary? Are we just supposed to pick which parts of the Bible we want to believe? How do we know that creation happened the way the Bible said it did? If it's all just random chance, if life was just a happy accident, a fluke, then the biblical scriptures have no meaning. But just take a look around you. All of this was not created out of chaos, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace.
And now the beginning leads us to the end of this journey anyway. And we didn't have to go back billions of years either. The evidence we uncovered today suggests that the dating methods that most scientists have been using are flawed, and that the age of the Earth may be counted in thousands rather than millions of years.
And this matters because knowing that there's scientific evidence that backs up what we know in our hearts to be true strengthens our faith. And this matters because knowing how we got here helps us understand who we are, why we're here, and how we should live our lives. I'm Marcus Lloyd. Thanks for joining me in this episode. And our next show, we'll take a closer look at dinosaurs because they raise big questions about faith. For a long time, scientists believed that these creatures roamed the planet tens of millions of years ago. But modern technology is leading us to question these findings. Why is it important that we get accurate information on the age of dinosaurs? We'll come back and we'll look closer into this and other mysteries contained in the book of Genesis.
Good stuff, right? Exciting. Doo-doo-doo. So I have a belief that the reason that you have so many people pushing in secular part of circles, if you will, is that if you push away God, then you don't have to be responsible or accountable to God. And so the more that you believe that the earth is 1.5 billion years old, the farther away God is from you, and the farther away His dominion is over us. And so you don't have to do that because that's way in the past. And I think that's at least one plausible reason why you have people that want to cling so desperately to this secular idea that the earth is so old and that the galaxy and the universe is so old. Anyway, so those are the central verses that were in the video. I would also add in there, Mark 10, I'll just read it real quick. So it's 10:6. But from the beginning of creation, this is Jesus talking, God made them male and female. Now he's talking about divorce at that particular point, but the fact that he said, in the beginning, God created male and female, that's relevant because before sin entered the world, there was no death. And if there was no death, then you can kind of extrapolate back. Well, if there's no death, then and Adam was the first, person, and Eve the second. Well, if you go along with secular thought, then there should be lots of death before Adam and Eve. But, Jesus tells us there wasn't, so I'll go with Jesus, right? Anyway, you got those? So, describe how faith plays a part in both the scientific and biblical evidence for Earth's age. Anybody? Yes, John.
Nobody was there to witness it, so they have to fake it out. They have to believe how it happened.
That's right. Nobody was there.
So it takes faith in either system.
It does. Anybody else have any thoughts on that?
I just don't have enough faith to be a non-creationist. I honestly believe, and it sounds sarcastic, I don't mean it to be, but I think if you're quantifying the amount of faith that it takes to believe something,
Mm-hmm.
it's really hard for me to grasp just random chaos coming into being and having the order that we see and that we experience.
Right.
And the creation continues to recreate.
No.
Plants after their kind, animals after their kind.
Mm-hmm. Well, in I think it was the first one or maybe the second in the series, we talked about that. We talked about getting something from nothing. It's scientifically impossible to get something from nothing. So what was that great big something that started everything? And so, and energy doesn't get bigger as it goes along, it gets smaller, and that's the laws of entropy and any. I promised we wouldn't go deep into science tonight. Yes?
God wanted to, he could have laid a whole blueprint out, perfectly plausible, provable, without faith involved. But it's contrary to all that in his nature, where he wants us to come to him by faith, not by an accumulation of all the facts.
Right.
He always wants us to come by faith. So he intentionally, purposely gave it to us like this, because he always wanted to have that faith factor built in there. Not you believe because of the facts, not like the doubting Thomas. So you believe because you touched, or you believe because with a pencil and paper, you figured this all out.
Right.
No, you need to believe by faith.
Right.
You know?
And as Chuck has said, and as John has said, and many others have said, you have to have faith to believe the other argument as well, that we somehow evolved over, the last 1.5 billion years. So there's faith involved. Whichever way you go, there's going to be a leap of faith. So thank you. That's good. Come up with some simple examples of the 3 assumptions the clocks used by scientists share.
Assuming that it took a billion years for the Grand Canyon to materialize, the Colorado River flowed through it, instead of a very short order. Water is a very, very, very powerful tool if used in the right way. And that's 2 good ones.
Okay.
I think that an example might be the old style ice, or in two identical ice cubes, or close to the identical ice cubes, lay them on the kitchen counter side by side, and assuming your register isn't right over one of them, assuming climatic conditions are identical, a laboratory, if you will, to sterilize it, and they're going to melt at the same time. They're going to freeze at the same time. So you have 2 independent bodies going through that, just like he was using the 3-minute timer,
Right.
the sand through the hourglass
Right.
could reproduce it.
Okay.
They call that the constant rate, the closed process system, and the known process component.
Right.
Which is what he said.
But the problem with that is that we don't know what the situation was. I mean, we haven't covered the earth. We haven't seen the earth covered. None of us have anyway. We haven't seen the earth covered with water. So, and last week we talked about the old earth and the new earth. We're living on the new earth, right? I mean, even Peter talks about the old earth and the new earth. It's not just on, these videos. It's here in Scripture where old earth and new earth are referenced. And so we don't know. We do know that things were very, very different in the old earth. First of all, there was no decay because there was no sin. There was no evil lurking about in the world, destroying everything that is there. So we do know that. And so, you can extrapolate this conversation to all kinds of things, like, the age of some of the people that are in the Old Testament. How did they live, to be 900 years old? Or how did they live to be that old? And there's some people that want to put a spin to that and say, well, they really meant that it was every year that they say they're old, that you divide that by 12, and that's how old they really were. Well, that works if you're looking at Methuselah. But it doesn't work if you're looking at some of the younger folks. They would have been having, maybe like Enoch or Seth, they would have been having children at 5. So I don't know if I go that way, right? It just doesn't work. So the Bible isn't a literary device given to us to make us afraid of the boogeyman or anything else. It's what happened. It's an account of what happened. And so, like we talked about at the very beginning, we have to stop being bullied. We have to stop being intimidated to believe that the Bible isn't actual gospel. It's really what happened. It's not a story. I mean, there are people that believe that. I don't want to see a show of hands. There might be people here that believe that. But the point isn't to shame anybody. It's just to show that this is the way. The Scripture is the way, and we have to take all of it, and we have to believe all of it, because all of it's true. All right. I'm getting a little preachy. All right. What are some common dating methods most scientists use? Carbon-14, one of them. Any other ones? I didn't know this until I watched the video earlier today. The uranium, that's a good. But this zircon thing, it sounds like something made up, right? Zircon. Yeah, I got the ring of zircon. Well, helium. So, and if you noticed, if you go with the lead one, it's like, oh, well, that's 1.5. But if you look at the helium, well, that's 6,000. Well, that's about the age of the Earth, and it's kind of there. So that was really fascinating, I thought. So anyway, so we got those 3. What are some popular assumptions made about the Grand Canyon, and how do those fall short of the actual scientific evidence?
Assuming that it took 10 million years for that to happen, then the layers in there would account for that, like a tree, the growth rings in a tree. But they can't prove that. And if the flood did it, and we know for a fact, if you've ever seen evidence of a flood, water, it can do a lot of damage in a short period of time.
And Mount St. Helens, the great example that we saw last week and this week.
Yes.
I mean, perfect example of what can happen in a very, very, very small amount of time with probably far less force and water that was
And that's
existing.
steam.
Steam and water and lava and ash and everything. So yeah. So
It's either a little bit of water over a long period of time or a lot of water in a short period.
right. So what about the evidence of the layers that he was talking about, and the sand? So and those boulders, right? How do you get boulders just in down here in that bottom layer? I mean, how did those get there?
Sandstone is a salt rock,
Yeah.
and it can be formed pretty easy, such as that picture down there. That tremendously large rock was round, rolling in the water rolling it down, whatever, and it ends up being a round instead of oblong.
Right.
Because it is soft, it can be manipulated.
But the interesting piece there that I was kind of pointing at was that it was found at the bottom layer.
Yeah.
At the beginning. So, and there was not just one.
Yeah.
So they were talking, there was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. That makes it more like thousands, right? So there was a lot of rocks, big, giant rocks down there at the bottom. So they shouldn't be there if you're looking at it from a purely secular kind of viewpoint.
No, if it was a short time, then you just each layer come down through there, those wouldn't be there.
Right.
They couldn't be, because they weren't formed like that.
Right. They wouldn't be there if it was a long time. It'd be there for short.
Yes.
Okay. Anybody else on that? All right. And why is it so important to understand how the evidence supports the Bible's creation account as literal? And we probably beat this one up a little bit, but does anybody else have anything on that?
Because if you don't
I'm glad you said it just like you did. So how many of you knew that Charles Darwin was a Bible-believing Christian? I didn't. I mean, I found out in my research for this lecture tonight, or this discussion tonight, he was a Bible-believing Christian when he started out. And over time, he started accepting and being intimidated and accepting other theories that kind of mixed in. And help me out, John, or anybody else that might know. I think the guy's name was Lena or...
Charles Lyell,
That's it, Lyell.
yeah,
So Lyellian theory. And so that's who Darwin started listening. So he listened to him, and he slowly went on this decline. And so there's lots of Christians that believe that the earth is 1 billion years old. There's lots of them. And like I said, it's all about, you have to get right with the first chapter in the book, right? And so you're not going to just have conversations with people who don't have faith. They do. They believe, they love Jesus. They believe in Jesus. But they're going to tell you that, well, maybe it's 1 billion years old.
Why?
Because they've been able to blend it. And the reason why they've been able to blend it is because it makes them more comfortable in hard situations.
Okay, we were taught that in school years ago. And so that's where that distinct belief comes from. And you had faith in those people that was accurate. So it's going to make you have a way that between the Bible and what they said. And that isn't easy to do sometimes.
No. And it's not.
It's back to faith.
It's not easy to follow the Bible all the time, is it? It's not easy to follow what God has told us to do. The Israelites couldn't do it. I mean, over the entire course of history, we haven't been able to do what the Bible has told us that we need to do, what God has commanded us. We haven't been able to follow Jesus the way that he has told us to follow him. That's because we are human. We are frail. We are weak. We fall down, but we have to keep getting picked up, and we have to pick each other up. And so learning about this stuff, learning about creation, learning about what happened at the beginning is just another tool, like I like to talk about tool, is another tool to put in your toolbox to be able to pick your brothers and sisters up. Yes, Chuck?
One thing I was thinking about too is, and I've heard this argument from more than one source, that people I think sometimes confuse different books of the Bible are written from a different perspective. The Psalms, for example, may have been poetry, may have been put to music. There's almost a romantic presentation. Exodus and Genesis are pretty factual. They're straight at you. They start with, in the beginning, God. You can't be any more factual than that. Mm-hmm. It's not prose. It's not Song of Solomon, a love story to end all love stories. It's straight, hard-line facts. You either accept it or you reject it. There isn't any middle ground. And so I think we need to consider how is this book written? Is it prose? Is it are we using examples here? Is it, are they examples from, as you said, the day? Is it a 24-hour period? No. Or is it literal, or is it? So I think the type of book, the type of writing that it is, it's consistent throughout Genesis, consistent throughout Exodus. Each book has its own, I think I've said enough. You get the point.
No. I mean, each book was authored by a different person. So I understand there's a different viewpoint from the writer, but at the end of my day, we're using day a lot. At the end of my day, it's all God inspired. So whoever the author was, and whatever the purpose of it was, it's still God inspired, and so it's all 100% accurate. But in terms of, and I don't think that's what you meant. I think you meant it's the context of whatever that is. And you used a good example of the Song of Solomon. That's a love story. It's a love song. This is the book of Genesis. It's a historical, it's a factual, like this is what happened, this is what happened, this is what happened. It's Moses taking down what happened. And I think that's what you were saying. John?
A professor gave this as a said, if the literal sense makes sense, seek no other sense. You know, as he was saying, some of the stuff has a lot of images in it, and it's poetic and all of that. But if the literal sense makes sense, why try to explain the days away, or the years and all that other stuff? The literal sense makes sense.
That's good.
And so we just have to take it at face value.
Well, I mean, they want to take away the literal sense of the word day because that alleviates them from being responsible. Yes, Mary Jane.
I was just going to say, I think it's easier for an educated person to read the Bible and accept it just as it is. And you don't have to have all this other stuff going on because you've gone to college and you've got some experience. And it's just, I had no problem when I started reading the Bible. What it said is what I believe.
Amen. That's so good.
Okay, I like it. I mean, we're supposed to approach things in a childlike faith, right? Where's my pastor? That right? Childlike faith? That's how we're supposed to approach it? It doesn't mean you can't study it and get and go into detail and be able to have discussions, but a childlike faith. Yes, John.
I've always tried different ways to touch on that subject, but I think God spreads like almost a smorgasbord. He spreads a real wide table, and there are things there for everybody and easy, but some people are exploratory and want to see some of the higher things or try new things, and so some of the truths are great and they feed great minds. I think that's one of the evidences that God wrote the book.
Mm-hmm.
You can read John, which is kind of monosyllabic, the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. A child has no trouble with that. And the basic things that we need to know are good. And the Genesis account is pretty basic, and it's accurate. We have to read into it. They call that eisegeting. We have to read into it to find the things that these people are finding. Because if we just read out of it, it says what it says.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anybody else?
Well, and I think this study gives us some ammunition to have discussions with unsaved folks that believe this. And I think that's really, because growing up in the church, I was never told the earth was 6,000 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how many people were, but I was not.
I was not.
You know,
I mean, but I grew up in a Catholic church. It was a little bit different, but.
And so I think as you get older, you go to school, and you have PhDs, scientists telling you it's millions of years old, you know, but they're smarter than I am. So it's one of these things where, you know, when you see the fallacies of carbon-14, I was reading an article today. They did a carbon-14 test on a clamshell. It was several thousand years old, a live clamshell. Because it absorbs limestone, which is thousands of years old. Right. You know, and things like that. So it helps us, gives us some ammunition to be able to plant a seed of doubts.
And John gave an example of a colleague maybe a couple sessions back, but and I apologize if that was in confidence, but you had talked to a friend of yours, and no, you said it out loud to everybody. A friend where you had talked to them, and the wife was a scientist, and she called you and said, oh my gosh, I can't believe I believed the other way all this time, and now we got to get to my husband because.
Just briefly, this was a scientist that I met in the Bahamas. She and I were alone in the water and struck up a conversation. She found out I was a preacher, and she said she couldn't stand the idea of the word devil and evolution in the same sentence. She said, we all know that evolution occurred. And I said, no, we don't. And she said, oh no, you're not one of those, are you?
Yeah.
That's how our meeting started, but by the end of the week, this woman who was a born-again believer, but she just bought into the assumptions. And I used the Grand Canyon and Mount St. Helens with her. And she told me, I hardly slept last night. She said, my husband's religion, that was the thing, but is science.
Right.
And he hates your guts because you destroyed his religion in our conversation. And she said, I've never seen it. He was cussing you and throwing pillows in our room because you attacked his religion, but you were nice about it. You weren't mean.
Right.
And you just destroyed what he believes in.
Right.
So, but I had to take a stand. I had to say, no, we don't.
Right.
We have to
Well,
know that.
And that goes, so it goes back, yes, this is more ammunition, if you will, or tools, whatever term you want to apply to it. It gives us the ability to talk about what they would call science. It gives us a chance to talk about what happened at the beginning from a perspective that kind of throws them for a loop, right? And you're not trying to dazzle them or create any kind of smoke and mirrors, no illusions. It's just straightforward. This is what happened. It's 6 days. Here's why it's a day. That's a huge argument. Oh well, it was that one day, one of God's days. Well, no. This is what he said. It's one day. And you can get into the whole, you can talk about Hebrew with him and that language and why the word yom is the word. Why the word yom means basically 24 hours in this context. It's a very specific word. And that's what's really kind of beautiful about the Hebrew language. They use very specific words for things. And so you can't really, and the Greek is the same way. So, you can't really do a lot of dancing and interpreting because it's a specific word. So, anyway, anybody else?
Yes.
I feel like I've ignored this part of the room tonight. Well, see, John sat way over there tonight, so I'm doing a lot of turning this way.
I think what you're saying is so good, but we have to be kind about this. We dare not be haughty. The lady again. I asked her questions. I said, you're a scientist, I'm a layman. I said, could you help me? I said, when a mutation occurs, do we get more information or less? She said, always less. I said, well, how can we be evolving upward then?
Yeah.
She answered that for me, and then she said, oh, that's true.
Yeah. I mean, and thank you. And I hope in any of the discussions we've had that we've never talked about, nobody's getting beat up with the book. It's always with love and kindness that you approach people. They may not reciprocate that way, but it's always with love and kindness because there is no other way. So, thank you. So, next week, dinosaurs. That's not a dinosaur. That's an alligator. I took that picture. Yeah, no, you know what? I got to be careful with the whole copyright thing, so I usually don't take images off the internet. I usually try to find my own. So, yeah, I took that picture. Don't worry, he didn't get me. I survived. He didn't kill me. I survived.
It wasn't in your canal, was it?
That one was not, but there was one just like it. And then my neighbor showed me a picture this afternoon. He said, because we were talking about how I had been under the water, doing some repairs under my dock. And I was like, yeah, it's like 14 feet deep, and it's, I couldn't see. This was late summer, so the water was still murky back there. And it's saltwater canal. And he said, really? He goes, let me show you this picture. He goes, that's what's under our dock. And he lives next door, and it's a bull shark. And he's like, this guy lives under my dock. I'm like, oh, okay. So, and I'm down in there, digging around. Anyway, anything else? Any other thoughts? I think this was a great discussion tonight. A lot of food for thought. The one thing I didn't put it on a slide, but ICR.org. I know I've pitched them, and I don't get any money from those guys, but maybe I should. But they have some great articles that you can. They're quick reads. They're like 5-minute reads, and it's free to read those articles. So I encourage you, if you have access to the internet, go check it out. If you have some free time, download it on your phone. They even have a podcast now. It's not necessarily on creation, on what we're studying right now. It's always creation because that's the Institute for Creation Research. But anyway, ICR.org, if you check out some of their articles, they have some really, really great articles. So that's all I got. All right. See you next week. Dinosaurs.